everyone, it's Lindsay here. I am guest designing for Kat Scrappiness, and I want to share with you 3 different ways to use the new cover plate die from Kat Scrappiness. This is the butterfly backdrop cover plate die. It is so gorgeous. You could just die cut it, throw some pattern paper behind it, throw a little ink blending behind it, put it on a card base, and you're ready to go. But I want to take it up a few notches and show you 3 different techniques that you can use with this die that are a lot of fun and really easy. So for my first card, I'm going to go ahead and cut a piece of white cardstock. This is heavyweight white cardstock. You want a nice thick cardstock to slightly bigger than A2 size. The die itself, when it cuts out an A2 size panel, so it will cover your entire A2 card base. I want to have a little bit of a border here, so if I mess up placement, it's not going to be a huge deal. So I'm cutting my panel to slightly larger than A2, and I'm overlaying a piece of full adhesive over this. I want to keep that backing paper, but this is going to create a nice thick layer. I will run this through my die cutting machine, and I'm just going to run it through once. You don't want this to cut all the way through because you want the pieces together still. If you do have a die cutting machine with a lot of pressure and it cuts all the way through, that's not a big deal. You can just inlay the pieces later, but I just happen to like the look of it all being one piece. So I ran that through once, and there I have my panel. Now again, this didn't cut all the way through, so I am going to need to release that border around there. You can use a paper trimmer if you want to. I just grabbed my craft knife and ran around all 4 edges. Now with this die, it does have a little bit of a rounded corner, not a big rounded corner, just very slight so it's not too sharp. Just be careful when you're cutting around those so you don't chop them off. And you don't need to apply too much pressure with your craft knife when you're cutting through this. It does cut quite a bit of the way through, so you're not going through a very thick layer here. I'm going to be careful on this last corner and just get this to release. You don't want to force it, but once it's released, there's my panel I'm going to be working with. For the butterflies, I'm going to start by removing the backing paper on these. I'm using my craft knife to do this just because I don't want to cut underneath my fingernail. I've done that before trying to get up backing paper. And I'll just continue to release all that backing paper on each one of the butterflies, leaving the larger background completely covered with the backing paper still. I do want to say this is not my technique. This is a Jennifer McGuire technique from a while ago, a long time ago really, but I'm just getting around to trying it myself, and I wanted to share it with this die here today. For my glitter today, I'm going to be using this Wow microfine glitter. You do want to use a fine glitter for this technique. I think it works better. You could use a chunkier glitter. Just know that you're not going to have as precise of a background or results or smooth of a background either. I'm doing 2-toned glitter on my butterflies. So I'm starting off with this turquoise color. To get the placement, I'm using my craft knife again. This is one of the most underrated tools in the craft room in my opinion. And I'm just picking up a little bit of that glitter on the knife itself and then placing it in the center of each butterfly where the body would be. Now this is completely optional. You can do just one color and that's gorgeous too. I just wanted to see how this looked and I really like the look of it. So I'm glad I took the extra time. Now the thing about doing a 2-toned glittered butterfly is you're going to commingle 2 colors of glitter. So you're not going to be able to put any of this glitter back in the jar unless you want it contaminated with another color. You can't sit there and pick out little pieces of microfine glitter. So I would suggest using sparingly so you're not wasting a lot of product and you're not throwing away a lot of product either. So I'll finish up putting down my little bodies of my butterfly with my turquoise, and then it was time to move on to the next color once I got all of those colored in with the turquoise. For the wings, I'm using this pink, and I'm using the shaker end on this bottle of glitter that really helps control the amount I'm putting out. Again, this is going to look like I'm putting down a ton, but it's a very thin layer. You just want to make sure that the adhesive is completely covered with glitter. You don't need a ton of it. And you'll see as I go through this and kind of lift up the bottle, It looks like a lot on the paper, but I'm not using a lot at all. Barely any has gone from the jar. Now at this point, once you have the blue down, you can go ahead and sprinkle the pink right over the top of it. It's not going to matter much because you already have blue attached to the adhesive where you want the blue glitter. Your pink is not going to get in the way of that. So always start with your smallest color first and then go on to your larger section. That way you can be a little bit more messy with it. Once I had that completely covered, I'm going to take that backing release paper and put it right over the top of where my glitter is and press down with my bone folder, burnishing that in. You could also use a brayer here and really give it a good press if you wanted to. I just like my bone folder to really press down with this and really get into all those little nooks and crannies. Now I like to move my release paper around. It's got a nice slick surface on the other side, so it moves very freely. If you don't have the release paper, or maybe the adhesive you're using doesn't have the release paper, you can use wax paper or computer paper for this. Once I know the glitter is nice and pressed in, I'm going to go ahead and shake and dust off the rest of that glitter. Now, this is a pretty messy technique. I'm going to show you how I clean up all my extra glitter once I'm finished with this. I like to use a dry brush just to get rid of all those little extra pieces on there. You do want all that glitter gone before you move on to your next step so it doesn't get in the background. So clean up your surface, clean up your work area with the glitter, and then you can move on to your next color, which is the background. When choosing a color for your background, make sure you choose a nice contrasting color. I almost wish I would have went with like a clear glitter here, but I did pick the champagne color and I don't think, in my opinion, it was contrasting enough. It looks almost monochromatic, which I just went with because I did like the look of it. But just for future reference, whenever you're doing this technique, make sure you go ahead and think about the contrasting colors and how well these colors are going to look up next to each other and stand out from one another. At this point, you can just cover your background completely with the glitter. You don't need to worry about contaminating those butterflies, and you can go crazy here because I'm just using one color. All this glitter that I'm putting on can be put back into the container, so you're not wasting any. I'll use a piece of computer paper right over the top and just press it down into the adhesive with my bone folder, making sure I give it a really good press. And then again, using that dry brush, this is actually a Clarity stencil brush, and just brushing away all that extra glitter that's not attached. I also like to brush off the sides just to get any little sharp pieces of glitter that might be hanging around to make sure they're nice and smooth down. Now once that is all dusted off, there is your background. It is so gorgeous and sparkly. I absolutely love it. But you do have all that glitter to worry about, so what I like to do is take a lint roller and just roll it across my surface. This is what you would use for like pet hair or lint on your sweaters or pants or whatever. I like to use it in my craft room for cleaning up glitter and embossing powder. It also works great for if you spill any seed beads, things like that, or just little pieces of paper from a die cut that you're popping out and they get everywhere. This is a lifesaver. It saves so much time and it saves your fingernails from having to pick up all those little pieces. To finish this card, I did it very, very simply. I added a border from the zigzag border dies from Kat Scrappiness that are new this month. And again, I went with the monochromatic theme. So I cut those from craft cardstock and attached those to the top and bottom of the panel to kind of frame out the glitter background. I put a little hay there in the bottom right hand corner and attached a few brown jewels from Kat Scrappiness as well to finish off this card. It was super easy. I attached the whole thing to an A2 top folding card base, and that was it. There's a look at the finished card, and now let's move on to the next one. So for my next card, I'm going to go ahead and cut this same butterfly backdrop die from some heavyweight white cardstock. This is going to be A2 in size, so it's going to cover up my entire card base, so I don't have to worry about doing any borders or anything around it, which is great. I'll run that once through and once back just to make sure I get a nice cut on it, and then I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of ink blending. I cut a background panel to do my ink blending on, and just to make sure I don't have to worry about getting this lined up exactly when I go to put it back on that butterfly backdrop, I cut it slightly smaller, just 1/8 of an inch from the top and the side, one top, one side, and it's going to fit fine and it's going to cover up all those butterflies, but I don't have to worry about exact placement, which I love. For my ink blending today, I'm going to be using VersaFine Clear inks. I've got 3 different colors. I'm starting off with this turquoise, which is Warm Breeze. I'll go for Fantasia, which is a nice bright purple in the center. And then for my final color, I'll be using a very bright pink, which is Glamorous. I wanted to use my VersaFine Clear inks because they are very pigmented, they're very bright, and I can really build up the color with these in no time at all. Whenever I'm doing a background like this that's going to be covered up with dyes, I don't worry about getting perfect ink blending. I don't take my time with it. The majority of it's going to be covered up and you're not going to see all those splotches. It's just not going to matter. So I don't take a ton of time with this. I wanted to build up as much color as I could, as tensely as I could, as fast as I could, so I could get on with the rest of the card. There are certainly those times where you want to take 20-30 minutes to blend out your background and make sure you don't have any harsh lines. This is not one of those times. It's going to be covered up. Don't even worry about it. So I'm going to finish up with my pink color right there on the bottom. Now, if you wanted to take this another step further, you could do some heat embossing over this. You could do a lot of different things on this background. You could switch up the color combinations, do whatever colors you want. This is really one of those techniques where you can customize it to fit your card making style. Once I had that all blended out, it was time to move on to my little butterfly pieces. So whenever I die cut my butterfly backdrop, I took all those little die cut inlays and just popped them into a little glass off to the side. That way I knew I had them all until I could get to work on them. I wanted to do this after I did my ink blending because I knew I was using pigment ink and it needed a little time to dry before I went and started laying white cardstock over the top of it. To put a little crease in these, I am using my paper trimmer and just very, very quickly creasing right down the center, lining it up using my bone folder, putting a score mark in there, and then folding it. This is going to give some nice dimension to those butterflies. There are a few butterflies that are kind of on their side, so I'm just going to come in about 1/8 of an inch from that side and score and just fold up both wings is what it would look like. Then it was time to start putting everything together. So I attached some double-sided adhesive to the back of that butterfly backdrop, and I'll just go ahead and place that ink blended background to the back of it so the color is facing through the butterflies. Again, because I did just that little bit of extra off the sides, I don't have to worry about perfect placement, but the butterflies are still going to be covered with ink. And there is a look at that. Is that not gorgeous? This would make a gorgeous card as is. You could leave it, maybe throw a little bit of glossy accents over the butterflies to give them a nice glaze. A lot of different things you could do from here. But what I decided to do was take each one of those butterflies, add a little bit of foam right to the center, and pop them right back into place. Do a little die cut inlay, but add that dimension by just squeezing up those little wings and letting them float free from the paper underneath, which I think is just such a fun technique and a little surprising. Now, I did each one of my butterflies, but again, this is totally customizable. You could just do this one large butterfly. You could just do a few little butterflies, leave the rest of them open, and have some ink. You could do a different color of butterfly, so you could do maybe some gold foil on them. It really is up to you how you want to customize this to fit your card making style. I'm a clean and simple girl, so that's what I went for with this card. But I love that pop of color you get underneath the wings. And again, this might be a little bit too much dimension for someone, especially if you're sending it through the mail. I totally get that. So you could skip the foam tape and just use double-sided adhesive and place these down and just use the wings as the dimension on the card. And if they ever get a little flat, just pinch them up together and they'll give that extra dimension that we're looking for. With this technique that I'm using here, though, I am using teeny tiny pieces of foam tape to put these down, especially when I get to like the side leaning butterflies. They're going to be very, very small pieces that I'm using. So you want to make sure you're using a nice strong adhesive to put these down, especially with tiny die cuts. They're very easy to kind of push off when you're putting them in an envelope or taking it out or sending it through the mail. So make sure you use a nice strong adhesive so your card stays together, especially through the mail. Now for each one of those side leaning butterflies, what I did was I just took a little bit of fun foam, put it right where the body of the butterfly would be, and then attached the scored butterfly that I had made. And you can just kind of use your fingernail to pull up the wings a little bit so they have that added dimension, just like the rest of the butterflies do, even though they are side leaning. I'll finish up with this last little tiny butterfly. I saved the smallest one for last, and this is why you want to use that strong adhesive. You can see how tiny of a piece of foam I am using here, but because I'm using a nice strong adhesive, it's going to stay in place and it's not going to fall off on me. Once I had that last one down, I went ahead and mounted the whole thing to a card base, added a little hugs in the bottom right hand corner, and that card was done. And there you can see me just pinching up those little wings if you ever feel like you want a little dimension, a little bit more to see that color underneath them. I love the way this one turned out. Now I did add a few of the white jewels from Kat Scrappiness just around the little butterflies. Again, tying in that whole monochromatic theme here with that little pop of color underneath the wings. This one is so cool, especially from the side. One final look at this card, and then let's move on to the very last card. So this is a very clean and simple card. It's very flat, but to kind of kick it up a notch, I'm going to make a shape card base. I am using the zigzag dies. This is the rectangle set from Kat Scrappiness, and I'm using the largest one in the set. I'll run this through my die cutting machine 2 times with heavyweight white cardstock. You want to make sure when you're making a shape card base, you use the same kind of cardstock you would as when you're making a regular card base. You want a heavyweight, something that can hold up, stand up on its own, not flop over or anything like that. So I ran that through twice, and then I'm going to take my back die cut and give it a score mark about a ½ inch from the top. Again, I just use my paper trimmer. You can use a Score Pal, Score Buddy, whatever you have on hand. And I use my bone folder to give it a nice good crease. And I fold it back one way and then back the other just to make sure that everything is going to open and close nicely and you're not going to have any trouble with it. To put this together, I'm going to use a little bit of dry adhesive on the top. You could use wet adhesive, but I'm impatient, so I use dry. And I put a little bit of adhesive above that score mark. Then I just line up my 2 die cuts. They're nice and symmetrical since it's the same die. And I'll just give it a press once I give it lined up right there on the top where the adhesive is. And there is my card base. Super duper simple, but it just adds the nicest little touch to the final card. To make the rest of my card, I'm going to be working directly on the card base. I have some painter's tape that I've lined up with those stitched lines and made a little rectangle right in the center. I'll be ink blending in that rectangle, but I want to keep those nice white edges, and I taped the whole thing just down to a piece of computer paper to catch all that extra ink. I did have a little bit of leftover ink from some previous ink blending that I did before with my VersaFine Clair inks in that second card, but I just quickly wiped that off and then I can go ahead and start ink blending. I'm using dye inks for this because I know they blend really well. You can use distress inks, whatever you have on hand that blends really well. Oxides work great too. But this is going to show up. You're not going to have anything over it. This is going to be the main focal point of the card. This is one of those times you want to take your time ink blending, really put in some effort, make sure you get that nice blend. So I did take a little bit longer with this than I did with my second card. I'm using some pastel colors here. I want this to be a nice spring looking card. I think that looks great with the butterflies. And what I'm going to be doing is actually a silhouette stenciling technique. So I'll be using black ink through the stencil. So always think about what color of ink you're going to be putting through your so-called stencil that I'm using today. It's really a homemade stencil. Make sure that you've got that nice contrast. So I'm using black today, so I'm going very pastel. If you wanted to go with a darker ink, you could always do a white stenciled image. So I finished up ink blending my little rectangle, and then it was time to remove all of that painter's tape. I like to just go ahead and peel it straight back on itself. A little tip that is good if you don't want to rip your paint or you don't want to rip your cardstock. Before you put your tape down, stick it against your shirt or your arm or anything with a little bit of lint to take away that little bit of stick, and that will help it release a little bit easier. Also, pulling it straight back on itself and taking your time. Don't force it. If it starts to rip, come from the opposite direction and try and prevent any more ripping from happening. I wanted to keep those nice white edges, so right on the outside of the stitching I did put some more masking tape down, and now I will be using that very first piece I did, the backing paper from the adhesive sheet. I'm going to use it as my homemade stencil. This is a nice little stencil because it is a slick surface, so the ink will you don't waste a lot of ink. It's not going to absorb into it. You don't want to apply any water or anything like that. You're not going to get a ton of uses out of it, but it does work great. Now, if you don't have any backing paper and you wanted to do something like this, you could use regular cardstock for it. You could use computer paper. Just make sure that you're very careful with computer paper. Or you could cut some acetate, and then you've got a stencil that'll last for a pretty good amount of time. For my ink through the stencil, I am using a pigment black ink. You don't want to really use a dye ink because it's going to absorb into the paper and kind of commingle with those inks already in the paper. You're not going to get as good of a result. You can use it and layer it up and layer it up if you want to go that route. If that's all you have, you can definitely do it. But if you have the pigment ink, I would suggest using that over a dye ink. Also, if you don't have a pigment ink, you could use Versamark ink and do some black heat embossing over it. That'll give you a nice shine and also give you a little bit of dimension. If you wanted to take it even further, you could use a modeling paste through this as well. A black modeling paste, that would be gorgeous, and it'd give you a nice amount of dimension. Another option is to use a heavy body acrylic paint through this, and that's going to give you a really, really intense black look. You know it's going to cover up all of that ink underneath too. You're not going to have any guesses of, did it cover it up? Did it not cover it up? Is it going to show through? You know the paint's going to work. Once I remove that stencil, I've got this gorgeous butterfly silhouette over my background. I absolutely love the way this looks. I love this technique. It's a quick way to make a great card, and these make some great thinking of you or sympathy cards, in my opinion. Now, I did have a little bit of ink get through my painter's tape. That's okay. I just take a sanding eraser. You could also use a sanding block or a filing nail file, and you want to work in layers. So start with a very light hand, continue with a very light hand, and just sand until you don't see any ink anymore, especially when you're working on something like this where I was working on the stitching of the die cut. I didn't want to lose any of the stitching, so I just worked in a very light hand. It takes a little bit of time and a little bit of patience, but it's much, much worth it than just going in and kind of scratching away until you get it. I added a little just a note sentiment in the bottom right hand corner and a few silver jewels from Kat Scrappiness to finish this very simple card. I absolutely adore this one. It's probably my favorite. One final look at that card, and then all three cards. They're all so different, but they're made with the same exact die, which I love. I hope you guys enjoyed this big long video. That is going to do it for me today. Thank you for watching, and happy crafting.